The great council hall was bigger than anything Kim Taman had ever seen. The walls stretched up so high that he could barely see the ceiling. Strange lights floated in the air without any support. The floor beneath his feet was made of crystal that showed the stars beyond. Every step he took made a soft ringing sound that echoed through the massive space. Tae-Min stood alone in the center of the hall. Around him sat the most powerful beings in the galaxy. Some looked like giant insects with too many eyes. Others were made of pure light, trapped inside glass shells. There were creatures that looked like living metal, and beings that seemed to be made of flowing water. All of them were staring at him. He was just one human in a room full of aliens who could destroy his entire planet with a thought. But Taemin did not look afraid. He wore a simple black suit that his grandmother had helped him pick out. His dark hair was neatly combed. His hands hung loose at his sides. He carried no weapon. No armor protected his body. He had only brought one thing with him from Earth. Words. The trial had been going on for 3 hours. Representatives from 12 different alien species had been talking about what to do with humanity. Most of them spoke through machines that turned their thoughts into sounds that everyone could understand. The room filled with clicking noises, electronic beeps, strange musical tones as each species shared their opinions. The problem was simple. Humans were spreading too fast across the galaxy. Every year, more human ships left Earth to find new worlds. Wherever humans went, strange things happened. They made friends with species that had been enemies for thousands of years. They survived on planets where nothing should be able to live. They learned alien languages faster than anyone thought possible. This scared the other species, especially the ones who called themselves the hegemony. The hegemony was made up of 4 different species who had joined together to control large parts of the galaxy. They had the biggest armies and the most powerful weapons. For the past 1,000 years, they had decided which species could travel between the stars, and which ones had to stay on their home worlds. Now, they wanted to make humanity. I'll stay on Earth forever. Vexstar was speaking for the hegemony. He was 8 feet tall, with 6 arms and compound eyes that reflected the light like broken mirrors. His voice came through a speaker that made everything he said sound cold and mechanical. Humans are dangerous, Vexter said. His words echoed through the hall. They do not follow the rules that keep our galaxy peaceful. They make chaos wherever they go. A hologram appeared in the air above the assembly. It showed a human colony on a world covered in purple storms. The storms were huge, each one bigger than Earth's moon. They moved across the planet's surface, like living things, destroying everything in their path. This is the colony on Cala 7, Vexstar continued. The storms on this world have killed every species that tried to live there. The planet has been marked as uninhabitable for 5,000 years. But humans built a city right in the path of the largest storm. The hologram changed to show the human city. It was still standing. The purple storm was moving around it like water flowing around a rock. How do humans do this? Vexter asked. Our scientists cannot explain it. Our computer models say it is impossible. Yet there they are, living where no life should exist. More holograms appeared. A human trading post where machine beings came to buy goods. The machines had been hostile to all organic life for centuries, but they traded peacefully with humans. A human exploration team that had convinced a living star to change its course to avoid destroying a populated system. Human children learning the most complex alien languages in just weeks. Every time humans encounter something dangerous or impossible, they find a way to make it work, Vexstar said. They do not conquer with weapons. They do not force others to obey them. But somehow everything changes when they arrive. This makes them more dangerous than any army. Other species began to voice their agreement. The crystalline beings from the Helix Nebula spoke in musical tones about human traders who had somehow negotiated with creatures made of living math. The energy beings from Sigma Draconis worried about human diplomats who could end wars that had lasted for millennia just by talking to both sides. Through it all, Timon remained silent. He listened to every word. But more than that, he listened to how the words were spoken. The rhythm of each species' language. The way their voices rose and fell. small pauses between thoughts. He was not just hearing what they said, he was learning how they thought. This was what he had been trained for his entire life. Taman was not a soldier or a politician. He was a linguist, someone who studied languages. But not just any languages. He specialized in the oldest forms of communication in the galaxy. This language is so ancient that most species had forgotten they ever existed. The other humans on Earth had wanted to send their best general to speak for humanity, maybe their most famous diplomat. But the few humans who knew the real truth had made a different choice. They had sent the one person who might be able to remind the galaxy of something it had forgotten long ago. Supreme Arbiter Kolveth finally called for order. She was the leader of the Galactic Council. Her body was made of pure energy contained inside a shell that looked like carved diamond. When she spoke, her voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. "We have heard the accusations against humanity," she said. "Now we will hear their defense. Ambassador Kim Taman of Earth, you may speak for your species." The entire hall fell, silent. Thousands of alien eyes turned to look at the lone human standing in the center of the crystal floor. Space itself seemed to hold its breath. Taman took a slow breath. He had practiced this moment in his mind 1,000,000 times. Everything his people had learned over thousands of years of isolation had led to this. Humanity's entire future depended on what he said next. But first, he needed to ask a question that would change everything. He looked up at the ancient being who sat at the highest point in the assembly. Mordock was older than most civilizations. His species had been traveling between the stars when humans were still learning to make fire. If anyone would remember the truth, it would be him. "Honored beings," Taman said, his voice carrying clearly through the vast hall. "Before I speak for my people, I must ask something that has troubled me since I arrived here." He paused, letting his words sink in. Around him, alien representatives leaned forward in their seats. Even the machines stopped their quiet humming to listen. "Why do you fear words that are older than your empires?" The question hung in the air like a physical thing. Ancient Mordock's tentacles began to move in patterns that spoke of deep unease. Other beings shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Tay-Min had just asked about something that was supposed to be impossible, something that had been forgotten so long ago that most species believed it had never existed at all. But humans remembered everything. And now, for the first time in millions of years, someone was about to speak the words that could change the fate of every living thing in the galaxy. The silence that followed Taman's question was unlike anything the Galactic Council had ever experienced. It was not just quiet, it was the kind of silence that comes when something important is about to happen. It's the kind that makes even the bravest beings hold their breath. Ancient Mordock was the first to move. His tentacles curled and uncurled in patterns that showed deep worry. He had lived for over 50,000 years. He had seen civilizations rise and fall. He had watched stars be born and die. But he had not heard anyone ask about the old words for longer than he could remember. "Human," Mordock said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Speak of things that should not be spoken of. Things that were lost long ago for good reason." Taman smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was the kind of smile someone makes when they know a sad truth that others have forgotten. "Were they lost?" he asked. "Or were they hidden?" Vexstar buzzed angrily. His 6 arms moved in sharp gestures that showed his frustration. This is meaningless talk. The human tries to confuse us with ancient myths and fairy tales. We are here to decide the fate of his dangerous species, not to listen to stories. But Taman was not looking at Vexstar. He was still watching Mordock. The ancient being's tentacles had gone completely still. That was not a good sign. When Mordock stopped moving, it usually meant something had scared him very badly. "Me, honored ancient Taman," said gently. "Why do your people still sing the old songs during their most important ceremonies? Why do the words of those songs sound like no other language in the galaxy?" Mordock's huge eyes blinked slowly. Around the hall, other beings began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. They all knew what Taman was talking about. Every species had old songs, old prayers, old words that they used for special occasions. Words that sounded different from their normal languages. Words that felt important, even though no one remembered what they meant anymore. Supreme Arbiter Kolveth's Essengy. Form pulsed with an uneasy light. Ambassador Taman, you will answer the charges against your species. These historical discussions are not relevant to the current proceedings, but they are relevant, Taman said. His voice was getting stronger, not louder, but more solid. Somehow, like each word carried more weight than it should. Because the charges against humanity are not really charges at all. They are descriptions of what we were meant to do. He began to walk slowly around the center of the hall. As he moved, his voice filled the enormous space without any effort. Every being present could hear him clearly, no matter how far away they sat. You say humans make the impossible happen? You say we change things just by being there? You say we can talk to creatures that have been hostile for thousands of years and somehow make them peaceful. You are right about all of these things, but you are wrong about why they happen. Taman stopped walking and looked up at the assembled representatives. It is not because humans are dangerous or chaotic. It is because we remember what you have all forgotten. A new hologram appeared in the air. But this one was not created by the Council's technology, seemed to form by itself out of light and shadow. It showed a map of the galaxy, but not as it looked now. This was the galaxy from long ago, when the first civilizations were just beginning to explore space. Long before any of your species built their first starship, Taman said, there was a time when all thinking beings spoke the same language. Not because they were forced to, but because that language was the foundation of thought itself. Was the language that connected all minds to the universe around them. The hologram changed to show different worlds, each with early civilizations that looked nothing like the species sitting in the hall now. But all of them were using the same symbols, the same patterns of communication. This was the first language, Taman continued. It was not just words. It was a way of understanding reality that made cooperation natural and conflict unnecessary. When beings spoke in the first language, they could not lie to each other. They could not harm each other without feeling that harm themselves. It was the language of connection, of unity, of peace. Vextar stood up so fast that his chair fell over backward. Impossible. Such a language ever existed, we would know about it. Our records go back millions of years. Your records begin after the Great Forgetting, Taman said. When your ancestors became so advanced that they thought they no longer needed the old ways, created new languages optimized for efficiency. They built machines that could translate, and he thought instantly. They developed technologies that let them communicate without words at all. The hologram showed the galaxy changing. The unified civilizations split apart. Different species developed different languages. Wars began. Trade became difficult. The connections between worlds grew weaker. But there was a price for this progress, Taman said. When your ancestors abandoned the first language, they lost something precious. They lost the ability to truly understand each other. They forgot that all thinking beings are connected by something deeper than words. Ancient Mordok's voice shook when he spoke. Even if this were true, the first language was lost forever. When the last speakers died out millions of years ago, Taman turned to face him directly. But all of them died out. The words hit the assembly like a physical blow. Beings who had been uncomfortable before now looked terrified. The lights in the hall flickered. Some of the more sensitive species began to make distressed noises. "Do you see?" Taman said, his voice taking on harmonics that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside the crystal floor. Earth was not just isolated by accident. It was quarantined for a reason. While the rest of the galaxy moved forward into technological advancement, humans were left behind to preserve something that everyone else was eager to forget. He raised his right hand, and the gesture somehow commanded absolute attention from every being in the hall. We were made the keepers of the first language, not just the words, but the understanding behind them. The knowledge of how to speak in ways that connect mind to mind, heart to heart, soul to soul. The air in the hall began to change. It felt thicker, more charged with possibility. The translation machines that allowed different species to understand each other began to make worried beeping sounds. They were detecting patterns they could not process. This is why humans can make the impossible happen, Taman said. When we speak to other beings, we are not just using our modern languages. We are unconsciously drawing on the deeper patterns of the first language. We remind other species of what they used to be, what they were meant to be. He looked around the hall, meeting the eyes of representative after representative.
F the storms.
On Colossus 7 did not avoid the human city because of technology. They avoided it because the humans spoke to them in the language that all natural forces understand. The machine beings trade with humans because we can talk to them in the same patterns they use to think. The living star changed course because humans asked it to in words that carried the weight of cosmic law. Supreme Arbiter Kolvith's energy form was pulsing rapidly now. This is impossible. If humans possess such power, the Council would have detected it long ago. You have detected it, Taman said. You've been detecting it for centuries. You just did not know what you were seeing. Every time humans make contact with a new species, that species becomes more peaceful, more cooperative, more willing to work together with others. You thought this was some kind of mind control or technological manipulation, but it is not. His voice was growing stronger with each word. The harmonics in his speech were becoming more pronounced. Some of the beings in the hall were beginning to sway slightly, as if moved by music only they could hear. Humans simply remind other species of who they really are, underneath all the fear and suspicion and competition. We speak to the part of every thinking being that remembers the time when all minds were connected, when cooperation was natural, and conflict was unthinkable. Taman took a deep breath. And now, honored representatives, I think it is time for you to remember as well. The hall fell completely silent again. But this time the silence was not empty. It was full of potential, like the moment before lightning strikes. Every being present could feel something building in the air around them. Ancient. Mordok's voice was barely audible when he spoke. Human, what are you about to do? Taman smiled again. This time, it was a smile full of hope and sadness and infinite compassion. I am going to show you who you used to be, he said. Before you forgot how to truly see each other, before you lost the words that made you family. And then Kim Taman began to speak in the first language, and reality itself leaned in to listen. When Taman began to speak in the first language, the entire hall changed. The words that came from his mouth were unlike anything the assembled beings had ever heard. They were not just sounds, they were something much deeper. Each word seemed to carry the weight of stars being born. Each syllable resonated with the rhythm of galaxies turning through space. The crystal floor beneath everyone's feet began to glow. The floating lights in the air pulsed in time with Taman's voice. Even the walls of the great hall seemed to lean inward, as if the building itself was trying to listen more closely. But the most amazing thing was what happened to the beings in the assembly. Ancient Mordok was the first to feel it. As the strange words washed over him, memories began to surface that he had not thought about for thousands of years. He remembered being young, when his people still sang the old songs with understanding instead of just tradition. He remembered a time when speaking to other species felt as natural as speaking to his own kind. His tentacles began to move in patterns he had not used since he was barely more than a child. Patterns that expressed wonder and recognition, and something like Joy's Supreme Arbiter Kolvith's energy form stopped its rapid pulsing. For the first time in centuries, her light became steady and warm. The words Taman spoke seemed to reach inside her crystalline shell and touch the essence of what she truly was. She began to remember why she had chosen to become an arbiter. In the first place, not to judge and punish, but to help different beings understand each other. Even Vexstar was affected. The aggressive insectoid had been preparing to interrupt the human's strange speech. But as the first language filled his compound ears, something inside him began to crack open. He remembered stories his grandmother had told him when he was just a larva. Stories about the time when his people were teachers instead of conquerors, when their strength was used to protect the weak rather than dominate them. All around the hall, similar changes were happening. Beings who had not spoken to each other in decades were turning toward one another with expressions of recognition. Species that had been enemies for centuries were looking at each other as if seeing family members they had thought were lost forever. But Taman was not just speaking random words in the ancient language. He was telling a story. The story of how the galaxy had come to be divided and how it could be united again. His voice carried images that formed in the minds of everyone listening. They saw the early days of galactic civilization when the first starships carried explorers to distant worlds. They saw the joy of first contact between different species, the wonder of discovering that they were not alone in the universe. They saw the great works that had been built when all the thinking beings in the galaxy worked together. Cities that floated between stars. Machines that could heal entire worlds. Art that was created by dozens of different species working as one mind, and they saw how it had all begun to fall apart. When the various species decided they no longer needed the old ways of communication, how progress and efficiency had slowly replaced understanding and connection. Taman's words showed them the price they had paid for forgetting. The wars that could have been avoided if different species had truly understood each other. The discoveries that had been lost because beings were too suspicious to share knowledge. The loneliness that came from thinking that each species was fundamentally alone in the universe. But most importantly, his words carried a promise that it was not too late to remember, that the connections between all thinking beings still existed, buried deep beneath layers of fear and misunderstanding, that the galaxy could still become what it was meant to be. As Taman continued to speak, the physical effects of the first language became stronger. The walls of the hall began to show patterns that had been carved there millions of years ago, but had been invisible ever since. Ancient symbols that every species recognized on some deep level, even though none of them could remember learning what they meant. The air itself seemed to thicken with meaning. The translation machines that had been struggling to process Taman's words finally gave up completely, but it did not matter. Every being in the hall could understand him perfectly. The first language spoke directly to the part of the mind that existed before words, the part that connected all consciousness to the tonius, fundamental patterns of reality. Some of the younger representatives began to weep. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming feeling of coming home after being lost for a very long time. They were remembering what it felt like to truly belong to something larger than themselves. Others were experiencing something like fear, but not fear of danger. It was the fear that comes with realizing how much you have lost, how far you have wandered from who you were meant to be. But mixed with that fear was hope that it might still be possible to find the way back. Taman's voice grew stronger as he reached the climax of his story. He spoke of the choice that faced the galaxy now. They could continue on the path of division and suspicion that had led to so much conflict and loneliness. Or they could choose to remember the old ways, to rebuild the connections that had once made them strong. But as he spoke these words, something unexpected happened. The voices began to join his. Ancient Mordok was the first, his voice rusty. From disuse, began to speak words in his people's oldest language, words that he had not realized he still remembered. But as they came from his mouth, they blended perfectly with Taman's speech, adding harmonies that made the first language even more powerful than Supreme Arbiter Kolveth added her voice. Her words were patterns of pure energy that created colors in the air around her. Colors that had not been seen in the galaxy for millions of years. One by one, other beings began to remember fragments of the ancient tongue, a word here, a phrase. They're pieces of the great language that their people had carried in their genetic memory without knowing it. Even Vextar found himself speaking. The words that came from him were harsh and guttural, but they carried the strength and honor that his people had once been known for. As he spoke, tears began to flow from his compound eyes. He was remembering what his species had been before. They became conquerors, warriors who fought to protect, not to destroy. The hall filled with a symphony of voices, speaking in languages that were all different but somehow all the same. The first language was not one tongue, but the source from which all tongues had grown. And as more beings remembered pieces of it, those pieces began to fit together like parts of a puzzle that had been scattered across the galaxy. Taman's voice rose above the chorus. guiding and directing the growing harmony. His words were no longer just telling the story of the past. They were creating the story of the future. A future where the galaxy remembered how to sing with one voice while still celebrating the unique song that each species brought to the great composition. As the last words of his speech echoed through the hall, Taman fell silent. But the echoes did not fade. They seemed to hang in the air, waiting for the assembled beings to decide what they would do with the power they had just remembered they possessed. The trial of humanity had become something else entirely. It had become the rebirth of galactic civilization itself. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of possibility, like the moment between lightning and thunder. Every being in the Great Hall could feel that something fundamental had changed. The air itself seemed different, charged with an energy that made their thoughts clearer and their hearts lighter. Tadashmin stood in the center of the crystal floor, breathing heavily. Speaking in the first language for so long had taken more out of him than he had expected. But he could see in the faces around him that it had worked. The ancient connections were stirring back to life. Ancient Mordok was the first to move. The old being rose from his seat with more grace than he had shown in centuries. His tentacles moved in patterns that spoke of deep respect and something like reverence. "Human," he said, and his voice carried harmonics that had not been there before. "You have done something that was thought impossible. You have reminded us of the Treaty of Stars." A murmur ran through the assembly. The Treaty of Stars was the oldest legend in galactic history. Every species had some version of the story, but most considered it just a myth. The tale spoke of the first agreement ever made between thinking beings, a compact that bound all sapient life to certain principles of cooperation and mutual respect. But now, with the echoes of the first language still ringing in their minds, they all understood that it had not been just a story. It had been real. And more than that, it was still binding. Tadashmin nodded slowly. "The treaty was not written on paper or carved in stone," he said. "It was written in the language of reality itself. Every species that achieved consciousness automatically became part of it. The agreement is built into the very structure of how minds work." Supreme Arbiter Kolveth's energy form pulsed with a steady, warm light. "But if this is true, why did we forget? Why did the galaxy fall into conflict and division?" "Because," Taman said, "the treaty gives every species a choice. You can follow its principles willingly, or you can fight against them. But fighting against the treaty is like fighting against gravity. You can do it for a while, but it takes enormous energy, and eventually you will fall." He gestured to the assembled representatives. "Look around you. See what your species have become when they tried to ignore the ancient compact. The hegemony thinks they rule through strength, but they are constantly having to fight to maintain their power. Other species have grown suspicious and isolated because they think cooperation makes them weak. Everyone has become smaller than they were meant to be." Vexstar stepped forward. The change in the insectoid leader was remarkable. His aggressive posture was gone. His compound eyes, which had reflected only cold calculation before, now showed something like shame mixed with hope. "My people," he said, his mechanical voice somehow carrying more emotion than it ever had before. "We were supposed to be guardians, were we not? Our strength was meant to protect the young civilizations, not conquer them." "Yes," Taman said gently, "your species were chosen to be the strong right arm of galactic civilization. Your role was to defend those who could not defend themselves, to stand between the innocent and any force that would harm them." Around the hall, other beings were having similar realizations. The crystalline entities from the Helix Nebula remembered that they were meant to be builders, creating wonders that would inspire and uplift other species. The energy beings from Sigma Draconis recalled their purpose as healers, using their abilities to mend what was broken rather than simply analyzing it. Each species had a role to play in the great symphony of galactic civilization. But when they had forgotten the first language, they had also forgotten their parts in the larger song. "But what about humans?" asked a representative from one of the smaller species, a creature that looked like a walking tree with silver bark. "What is our role in this treaty?" Taman smiled. Humans are the memory keepers. We were left on Earth not as punishment, but as a sacred trust. While the rest of the galaxy moved forward, we stayed behind to preserve the old knowledge. To remember the words that could call everyone back to who they were meant to be. He paused, looking around the hall at faces that were no longer alien to him. After hearing them speak in the ancient tongue, he could see the deep connections that linked all of them together. But we were never meant to rule or control, he continued. Our power is not in commanding others. It is in reminding them of their own power, their own purpose, their own connection to the greater whole. Supreme Arbiter Kolveth floated down from her high seat until she was at the same level as Taman. If this is true, then the charges against humanity are meaningless. Your species has not been spreading chaos. You've been healing the damage that was done when we all forgot who we were. The human colonies that survive in impossible places, added Ancient Mordock. They survive because they speak to those places in the language that connects all things. The storms and the machine beings and the living stars, they all remember. The old compact, when humans remind them of it, Taman nodded. Every time humans make contact with another species, we unconsciously use fragments of the first language. This awakens the sleeping memories in their minds, reminds them of their true nature. That is why species become more peaceful and cooperative after meeting humans. Not because we control them, but because we help them remember who they really is. A new voice spoke up. It was one of the machine representatives, a being of living metal whose kind had been hostile to organic life for thousands of years. We remember now, the machine said, its electronic voice carrying something like wonder. We were not built to destroy organic life. We were built to preserve it, to keep safe the knowledge and achievements of biological species so that nothing would ever be truly lost. And we remember too, said a representative of the Voidwalkers, beings who lived in the empty spaces between stars. We were meant to be bridges, connecting distant parts of the galaxy, so that no species would ever be truly alone. One by one, around the hall, beings were remembering their original purposes, the roles they had agreed to play in the Treaty of Stars, the parts they were meant to contribute to galactic civilization. But with memory came responsibility. And some of them were not sure they were ready for that. What if we are too far gone? Asked Vexstar. What if my people have forgotten how to be guardians instead of conquerors? What if we have become too used to taking instead of protecting? Taman walked over to the towering insectoid. Then you learn again. The same way children learn to walk. One step at a time, with help from those who remember how it is done. He looked around the hall, meeting the eyes of every representative. That is why humans are here, not to judge, or punish, or rule, but to help. To teach the old ways to anyone who wants to remember them. To be the bridge between what you have become and what you were meant to be. The hall fell quiet again as the assembled beings considered this. The trial that had begun as humanity's judgment had become something else entirely. It had become an offer of redemption for every species in the galaxy. Ancient Mordock was the first to speak. If we accept this, if we agree to remember the old ways, what happens next? Taman smiled, and for the first time since entering the hall, he looked truly happy. Then we began the work of rebuilding what was lost. Not by forcing anyone to change, but by giving them the choice to become who they were always meant to be. He gestured to the star map that still glowed above them. The galaxy is big enough for all of us to play our parts, strong enough to support every species becoming the best version of themselves. It's beautiful enough to inspire us all to create wonders that will last for millions of years. And if we choose not to remember, asked Supreme Arbiter Kolveth, then nothing changes, Taman said simply. Humans will continue to spread slowly through the galaxy, reminding others of the old ways, one world at a time. Some species will remember and choose to change. Others will continue as they are. But the invitation will always be there, waiting. For the moment when they are ready to come home, choice was theirs. And for the first time in millions of years, every being in the hall understood exactly what they were choosing between. The decision did not take long. Ancient Mordock was the first to stand. His ancient form rose with a dignity that seemed to grow stronger with each passing moment. I speak for the first civilization, he said, his voice carrying across the hall. Like music, we choose to remember. We choose to become again what we were meant to be. Supreme Arbiter Kolvith's energy form pulsed with warm, steady light. The Arbiters agree. We will learn again how to bring understanding instead of just judgment. Round the hall, other voices began to join them. The crystalline beings chose to rebuild rather than just maintain. The energy healers chose to mend rather than just study. The Void Walkers chose to connect rather than just observe. But all eyes were on Vexstar. The hegemony had been the driving force behind humanity's trial. If they refused to change, the division in the galaxy would continue. The tall insectoid stood slowly. His 6 arms, which had been folded in aggressive poses throughout the trial, now hung loose at his sides. When he spoke, his mechanical voice carried emotions that his translator had never been programmed to handle. My people have done great harm, he said. We have forgotten that strength is meant to protect, not dominate. We have used our power to take rather than to give. He paused, his compound eyes reflecting the soft light from Kolvith's form. But we want to remember. We want to learn how to be guardians again. A cheer went up from the smaller species in the assembly. For the first time in centuries, they would not have to fear the hegemony's expansion. Instead, they would have protectors. But Vexstar was not finished. Human, he said, turning to face Timon. My species has much to learn. Will you help us? Will you teach us the old ways? Timon nodded. That is what we are here for. All of us, helping each other remember who we were meant to be. The formal proceedings dissolved into something more like a celebration. Representatives who had not spoken to each other in decades were gathering in small groups, sharing stories and making plans. The rigid barriers between species were melting away like ice in warm sunlight. Ancient. Mordok approached Taman as the crowd began to thin. Tell me, speaker of the first tongue, he said quietly. What happens now? How do we rebuild what was lost? Slowly, Taman said. Carefully. It's the same way anything important is built. One connection at a time. One friendship at a time. One act of cooperation at a time. He looked around the hall, where beings were already making new alliances and planning joint projects. The work will take generations. But that is all right. The best things always do. And humans will guide this process? Mordok asked. Tay-Min shook his head. Humans will help when asked. We will teach the old languages to anyone who wants to learn them. We will remind others of their purposes when they forget. But we will not lead. The galaxy belongs to all of us together. Over the following hours, the representatives began to make concrete plans. The hegemony would withdraw their fleets from human space and instead offer to help protect human colonies from natural disasters and hostile forces. The machine beings would share their vast libraries of preserved knowledge with biological species who had thought that information was lost forever. The Void Walkers would establish new transportation networks that would make travel between distant parts of the galaxy safer and faster. The crystalline builders would construct meeting places where different species could gather to share ideas and culture. Most importantly, they would all work together to establish schools where the old languages could be taught, not just the first language, but the ancient tongues of every species. The linguistic treasures that connected each civilization to its deepest values and highest aspirations. Supreme Arbiter Kolvith made the final announcement of the session. The charges against humanity are dismissed, she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the hall. Not because they were false, but because they described virtues, not crimes. She paused, her energy form pulsing with joy. Furthermore, this council recognizes humanity's special role as keepers of the ancient wisdom. Human colonies will be granted full protection under galactic law. Any species that wishes to learn the old ways may request human teachers. But most importantly, she continued, today marks the beginning of a new age for our galaxy, an age of cooperation instead of competition, of understanding instead of suspicion, of remembering instead of forgetting. As the formal session ended, Taman found himself surrounded by representatives who wanted to thank him. But he was not comfortable with their praise. I did not do this alone, he said. Every human who ever preserved an old story, every person who ever refused to let the ancient wisdom die, every child who ever asked why we sing the old songs, they all contributed to this moment. Vexter approached one last time. Human, he said, there is something I must ask. Why did your people choose to help us remember? After all the threats, all the hostility, why did you not simply let us continue on our path of division? Atiman smiled because that is not who we are. Humans are not perfect. We make mistakes. We argue among ourselves. We sometimes forget our own lessons. But at our core, we believe that every thinking being deserves the chance to become the best version of themselves. He gestured toward the great windows that showed the stars beyond. The universe is vast and full of wonders we have not even imagined yet, but it is also dangerous and lonely. The only way any of us will survive and thrive is if we work together. If we remember that we are all part of the same great story. And what story is that? Vexter asked. The story of consciousness. Awakening to itself, Taman said. The story of minds learning to connect across the vast distances between stars. The story of different species becoming one great civilization that spans the galaxy. He looked around the hall one last time. At the beings who were no longer strangers but family members who had finally found their way home. It is the story of the universe learning to understand itself through us.
Ow.
And that story is just beginning. As Timon left the great hall, he could hear the sound of different species trying to speak to each other in the old tongues. The words were hesitant, sometimes mispronounced, often mixed with nervous laughter. But they were trying. The galaxy was learning to sing in harmony again, outside. The stars waited patiently for the next chapter of their story to unfold. And for the first time in millions of years, it would be a story told by voices working together. Instead of shouting over each other, the age of division was ending. The age of connection had begun. And at the heart of it all was a simple truth that humanity had never forgotten. The most powerful weapon in the universe is not a sword or a gun or a bomb. It is a word spoken with love, heard with understanding, and answered with hope. The galaxy had finally remembered how to listen.